Folks, buckle up because our next guest has such an impressive resume that this intro might take a minute or two. But we are thrilled to welcome to Theater in College Hoops former starting guard at Army, one of the best scorers the Patriot League has seen, a national champion while on Duke's coaching staff, a decorated captain in the U.S. Army, the Joint Service Commendation Medal winner, and college basketball analyst for ESPN and Sirius XM. A little bit out of breath here, but we got Chris Spatola joining us. Chris, thank you so much. How are you?
I'm doing well, Subi. I'm doing a lot better after that intro. To that exhausting hearing all of that, but I appreciate you, man. You're too kind.
No, like I said, very extensive resume, a very impressive resume, and we're going to dive into a lot of that. But first, before I do that, I started following you, Chris, on Twitter, and I think your latest tweet, you were interviewing Jabari Rice there down at Texas and talking about his pump fake. I want to see how in lockstep we are to start this off. So I'm around early 30s.
Okay.
Who do you think I would say has the best pump fake in college basketball during my era, I suppose? Because the first thing that came to mind was this player.
Great question. I have no idea. That's a very unique question. Who is it? You got to tell me.
For some reason, well, I shouldn't say for some reason because it was a lethal pump fake, but you remember Sam Young?
Of course,
Pitt? Yeah. That guy somehow, I mean, you could barely slide a credit card under his feet, but he wasn't traveling.
No. You know, it's funny. And I've heard Billis make that comparison, and I think it's incredibly apt. And it's so funny, dude. When I was playing, it was my first or second year at Army, and I had kind of come to making a shot fake, not similar to Jabari's, but in the same vein, where I was kind of coming out of my stance, and it was an elongated shot fake. And one of my coaches said, you know, you shouldn't be doing it that way because you've got to stay in an athletic posture and you're coming out of your stance. And of course, being the good, follower that I was, I kind of took him at his word. And I really hadn't seen a shot fake like that until Sam Young. It's a great comparison. And then until Jabari. And it's amazing how effective it's been.
It has been. And look, you got to find a way to create any space that you can. You parlayed it into a wonderful career, not only on the court, but coaching as well. And we'll dive into all of that. But Chris, before I do that, one of the main reasons why you're here is because of Dallin Cuff. Why you're on this program, that is.
Yeah.
All right. And keep in mind, at the end of this, I'm going to ask you the same thing I asked Dallin. Who would you want, or who would you refer to come on to Theater in College Hoops? But what I want to do is just play exactly what Dallin said when I asked him that question. All right.
Chris Spatola, who I cover, I do a lot of serious ACC work with and stuff at ESPN, was a captain in the Army. Played at Army, 1,000-point scorer there. Coached with Duke in their 2010 team as an assistant. And he's just a really smart, interesting, funny guy. And I think when you ask good questions and ask for different stories, he'll deliver. And you let him wax poetic and pontificate like I did. You'll be impressed and have some fun with him because he's seen a lot, man. Do a couple tours of duty and in service, and you've won a championship. You've coached the Olympics in 2008. He's been around the block in a bunch of different ways, and he's also just a really funny, smart guy.
That's my guy. That's my guy.
Let me get your thoughts. The pressure's on me to ask the right questions, but I want to hear your feedback and your reaction.
There's no pressure. First of all, the respect is mutual. I don't pontificate and bloviate quite as long as Dallin does. I try to keep it a little bit more succinct. But no, he's incredibly bright. I think we relate on that level. I think we both think we're smarter than we probably are. But we enjoy basking in what we think is a higher intelligence. And he's incredibly kind. I have to tell you, dude, and I mean this generally, but certainly specific to Dallin. I'm not the most gifted individual, but what I have found in life is if I can surround myself with talented people, other successful people, or get myself involved with talented, successful organizations, I'm going to come out looking a lot better. And so that's kind of, it raises the tide of Spatola. And so Dallin is a good example of that. I have found in our professional interactions that anything he and I do together, I end up looking better, but the product ends up being better. And so you're a prime example. You said, come on, would you come on and talk to me? I said, well, if I'm around Subi, it's got to be good. And so let's make this happen.
You're making me blush. Let me ask you though, are you okay if I take creative liberty and name this show or name this episode Tide of Spatola? That's so good.
Yeah. Yeah, you do. You name it what you want. Maybe not that jerk off Spatola. That I probably wouldn't want you to go in there. But no, it's true, man. I'm telling you, I think self-awareness is something I learned that it's an important quality to have in anybody. And look, it's I know we'll get there, but it's a big reason why the United States. I couldn't have been a cadet. I shouldn't have been a cadet. But that environment and being around the people that I was around certainly lifted my tide, and being in the US military, it did the same. And then to go to Duke and work obviously with Coach K, but with the coaches that I worked with there, and to be at Duke University was exceptional. And then to be with ESPN, which is certainly a leader in its field. So it's kind of been the strategy here, brother, throughout my life.
It's been a blast following all of your pit stops and your career trajectory. And let's start from the beginning here, Chris. I've had the pleasure of interviewing a lot of former players, and what I'm always curious to know is the recruiting process and their decision-making process, because a lot of viewers like myself, we weren't fortunate enough, or probably didn't work hard enough to get to a D1 level. And so I'm always curious to know what went into a certain player going to a certain school. For you specifically, what about Army intrigued you? And take us into your decision-making and recruiting process.
Yeah, it's a great question. I was not by any means interested in being a cadet. I had never thought about any of the academies throughout my young life. But what I did want to be was a basketball player, and I wanted to be a Division I basketball player. And if you look at me, Subi, I'm not much to look at. I'm barely 6 feet tall. I'm about at that time I was probably about 145 pounds. So I wasn't highly recruited. I was coached by my dad in high school, so I had a good understanding of the game, and I was tough. That's again, how do you make it seem like you're more gifted than you really are? Well, toughness and competitiveness and just playing hard were sort of some of the gifts I had. And I was at an AAU event, and a member of Dino Gaudio's staff, who was the coach at Army at the time, saw me play there, a guy named Marcus Perez. And he mentioned it to Dino. I don't think Dino gave it much thought, but they brought me on a visit. And of course, my parents went on the visit, Subi. And to Dino's credit, and I have to preface all this by saying this was pre 9/11. So recruiting to the academy and the military changed significantly after 9/11. But at the time when I went on my visit to the academy, I think Dino might have said maybe 3 words to me. He spent most of the time recruiting my parents, and he knew exactly what he was doing because my parents fell in love with the place. I mean, marching around in a uniform and yes, sir, no, sir, and the tradition and the alums who had gone through there and the Eisenhowers and the MacArthurs and the Pattons. And he laid it on thick, man. And, for my perspective, it was a chance to play Division I basketball, and it was an opportunity to be successful in life, to have that on my resume. But even then, I was a little bit dubious of my ability to succeed there, and if I really wanted to do it. And it kind of harkens to a different time, but my parents were very aggressive in saying, you need to really look at that. They didn't go so far as to say you're going there, but it was basically what they were saying. Like, you don't have any other options even close to this. Both my parents were teachers, so we couldn't afford college necessarily. And so the opportunity to go there for free, and to say that you have the opportunity to be a cadet at the United States Military Academy was something that, outside of just the basketball opportunity, was something that, ultimately I couldn't pass up.
Chris, was there any apprehension or maybe self-doubt where you're saying to yourself, and again, your college experience is different than even that of another D1 athlete. Was there any self-doubt when you said, okay, let's go to Army, and you're thinking to yourself, well, can I hack it, not just in the classroom, but the physical demands and the other demands of being a service member, really?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. The two things that concern me the most, look, the getting yelled at and the hazing and the physical component did not scare me in the least. My dad was hard on me growing up. I have thick skin. And I'm very self-confident. So like it's gonna take a lot to bring me down, and again, and then the physical component, I'll go all day. I'll put my stamina up against anybody. The things that concerned me, one, were the academic component. I mean, I'm a smart guy, but I'm not the greatest worker in a classroom. Like, I want to work on what I want to work on. And so I thought my intellect I could certainly compete, but did I really want to go through the academic rigors of that place? That was the first concern. And the other was a social one, man. Like, again, I am not this like model person. I'll get myself into some trouble. I love to party. I love to hang out. I love to have a good time. And again, I'm not the most gung ho, living this rigid lifestyle type of a person. And so, do I really want to be calling my friends on a Friday night or a Saturday night and I'm in the barracks doing whatever it is we did in the barracks, and my friends are out, getting ready to go out and party, and the social component, the as a plebe, not getting to leave West Point your entire freshman year. Do I really want to go through all of that? So the academics and the social component were really the two things that kind of concerned me the most.
That makes sense. That makes sense. You
Yeah.
are a very physically fit individual. I can
I
tell you
appreciate
that. I mean, you already poked fun at yourself because of your stature, but I did have to ask, Chris, you have a number of a great deal of success. 6'1". We talked about getting open. How did you find that success on the basketball court?
Yeah. It's a really good question. I mean, look, I was a good player, like that first and foremost.
I
I
want
have
you to be totally unabashed. Say it
Yeah,
with your
no.
chest, man.
I say it more to my wife than anybody else. If I was 6'5", 6'6", I'd have been a really good high major player. It's just the fact of the matter. And it wasn't even necessarily my height. It was more, I just really was thin and I wasn't all that strong. And by the way, I had an adversity to the weight room. I would rather be out on the floor playing. And so even when I got to West Point and they're trying to put some weight on me, it just never took. But look, I was a good player. I could really score. I had a high IQ for the game, and I played my ass off. I think in look, this. I think motor in anything. If you have a motor in anything you do, it's going to be an advantage. I mean, I remember going out recruiting when I was coaching, and the first thing that stands out is players who play hard. It stands out. Players who talk, communicate, who are natural leaders. So I had all of the intangibles, and not to mention the fact that I was a pretty decent player, and at that level, I mean, the Patriot League, which is a really good level. I don't want to marginalize it, but you can function at my size a little bit better there than you can in the Big 12 or the Atlantic Coast Conference.
Have you come across a player covering them, interviewing them that kind of reminds you of yourself?
Yeah, Juan Dixon, who was playing at Maryland when I played, and I kind of modeled my game after Juan Dixon because I ended up moving to the 2 position. I started my first 2 years there as a point guard, and then they actually recruited my brother, and my brother ended up coming to the academy. He was 2 years behind me, and my junior year they moved me off the ball, and it was twofold. One, they wanted to play my brother, who was a good player, but two, I was a scorer. I had a scorer's mentality, and I ended up, as you said, leading the league in scoring my last 2 seasons there. And Juan Dixon was kind of that player. He was undersized, but he played off the ball. And Army, our coach there, ran a lot of similar stuff where he ran a lot of curls off of the pin downs. And so Juan Dixon was the guy. And I watched a lot of tape on him in the summers just to sort of model, how do you get open? How do you get your shot off? How do you play at that type of a size?
Juan Dixon, if I were to make a Mount Rushmore or a roster of players that were big reasons as to why I fell in love with college basketball,
Yeah.
he might be the starting 2 guard there. He's certainly got a spot. I don't know. Like, I'm thinking of guys like him, Rashad McCants. If I even go with Steve Blake, if we stay with Maryland, Jimmer, all these guys.
Yeah.
But Juan Dixon was a blast. So I could definitely see a little bit of him and you as well. Chris, I'm curious to know, and you had already mentioned this, so you might be reading my notes here, but one of the first questions that I thought of when I was doing this prep in looking at the time you spent in school is that it did intersect with 9/11. So you were on campus pre 9/11 and also post 9/11, correct?
Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about, I don't know how to best phrase this, how that impacted you and being at a service academy like that?
Yeah, it's fundamental, and I always like to preface, my sort of recruitment to West Point by saying that, I kind of consider it a full disclosure in that I don't know if I would have made the same decision. I don't know if my parents would have encouraged me to go there as much as they did, because part of the pitch from Dino Gaudio was that the military was not at war; it was downsizing. Bill Clinton was actually allowing people who had time left on their service to get out after like 2 years, and the commitment after you graduate is 5 years. So that was part of Dino's pitch. Like, look, come here, you'll do maybe 2 years of service, and then you'll be able to get out with an Army degree. And then 9/11 happened my senior year. And I'm standing in class as those two towers were coming down. And I knew immediately, Subi, A, we knew it was terrorism. And B, I knew that we were going somewhere, that all of us were going somewhere. It changed in an instant. And there was part of me that by that point in my cadet career had been a little bit indoctrinated, which is to say, okay, let's do this. This is what we've been training for. Obviously, there was a level of fear. And then obviously, on the day those towers came down and in the aftermath, you didn't really know exactly what that was going to look like in terms of timeline and when deployment and all of that. But it was a surreal moment and a surreal day. And as I like to tell people, it changed my outlook, not only in what I had done up to that point, but it changed my outlook the rest of my senior year. In that I had not to belabor this point, I don't want to talk too long,
Please
but
belabor it, please.
I had so at West Point, each sports team has what they call an officer representative. So basically, it's like a colonel who is the liaison between the academy and the civilian coaches. And they travel on the road to make sure you're shaving and you're dressing appropriately and all of that. But they're also mentors. And I was screwing up there. I mean, I was in trouble. I was walking hours. I was somebody who always wanted to go against the system because I think I'm smarter than the system. And our officer representative, his name is Darrell Williams, and he ended up being the superintendent. He just stepped down as a superintendent at the academy. So he became a general. Really bright guy, had played football there, was a part of had done work for the Obama administration during the Ebola outbreak, knows 5 languages, just a brilliant man. And he comes to practice one day, and after practice, he comes up to me, says, "I need to talk to you." I said, "Yeah, you got it, sir. Let's do it." And he walks me up, about 25 rows up into our arena. And we're sitting there and he says, "Listen," he says, "you're screwing up. You're screwing up this opportunity." And he said, "And it doesn't, look, I'm going to not lose sleep over this. You're not the only one that we have things like this with." He said, "But let me tell you something." He said, "In a few short months, you're going to be standing in front of 35 soldiers. And they're going to be looking at you, and you're going to be their platoon leader. And they're going to look at you and say, 'Okay, sir, what's next?'"
So real quick, Chris,
Yeah.
was this pre 9/11 or like was this
No,
sort of okay?
This is
9/11 had
after.
happened.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if he was saying he was putting out a scenario and it actually came to fruition.
No.
Okay.
It's perspective. You know what I'm saying? I think we all could use a little dose of perspective, especially young people. And he said, they're going to be looking at you and say, "Okay, sir, what's next?" And you better have the answer. And where you're screwing up is all the answers. A lot of the answers are here at this academy. If you apply yourself and if you do things the right way and you set a good reputation for yourself, you will be prepared to stand in front of 35 people who have their lives on the line based on your decisions. You'll be prepared to do that. And so it's sort of 9/11 and those types of conversations that I finally got my act together kind of finished out as best I could.
What a story. I'll tell you what, I've come off practice courts. I think this conversation pales in comparison. I was struggling with my AP physics class, and I had that conversation with my coach. That pales in comparison to what you went through. And Chris, let me ask you, when you were standing in front of those soldiers, did you feel prepared?
I felt prepared to be a humble yet in charge leader. And what I mean by that is I never let there be any doubt that I was the ultimate decision maker, and ultimately the success or non-success was going to boil down to me. But I also understood that as a young lieutenant, and I don't know if you know the dynamic, or people listening understand the dynamic, but lieutenants coming out of West Point, I was 23 years old. The platoon I was going to, I mean, the platoon sergeant, who was my right-hand man with that platoon, had been in the military for over 20 years. He was almost into his 50s. Like, he had served a long time. He was a grizzled guy. He had been a part of Desert Storm. So for me to go in there and act like I had all the answers would have been really stupid. And by the way, like, other soldiers in the platoon, other non-commissioned officers had been in the military for 5 years, 10 years. So to go in there as if I knew all the answers would have been the wrong way. And so I always, I took the tact of, especially with my platoon sergeant, always answering his questions with a question. So, what do you want to do, sir? Well, what do you think we should do? What would you do if you were me? And 95% of the time, Subi, I would go with what he had to say. Now, 5% of the time, I had another perspective. I had more of an academic perspective. I had been in meetings maybe he hadn't been in. I had a different perspective, maybe in terms of how I wanted culturally our platoon to go. And so I would offer maybe a rebuttal. Have you thought about this? And so I think in any organization, it doesn't matter if you're in charge or not. You've got to go in with the approach of what tone am I going to have when I go in there? And so I felt confident that I was capable. B, I was a pretty good leader, and sports was a big help in that, being a captain of a team and all that. And C, I felt like I had an idea of the tone I wanted to take with the platoon. And look, I didn't have all the tactical and technical answers, the equipment, all of that. I had a lot to learn. But when it came to managing people, I felt like I had a good game plan.
Absolutely. So, Chris, I want to ask this question, and please let me know if it's out of bounds. Did it ever go through your head, or do you think it goes through service academy athletes' heads where they know what they're signing up for? But is there a part of you or anyone else in the back of their minds that's like, yeah, but I want to be an athlete.
Mm-hmm.
I want this. And then, 9/11 happens, or you're called into service and you're like, damn, there's still this part of me that I just want to be an athlete. I don't know if I'm conveying this question properly, but is there any part of you that said, I wish I just was an athlete 100%?
All the time. And, there's a tad bit of resentment as a result. I remember being on my deployment to Iraq on a few occasions, in some serious situations, saying to myself, I just went to West Point to play basketball, and here I am in the Middle East with things around me that are in some cases severe. What happened? What am I doing right now? And then you got to shake yourself out of that and get over yourself and ultimately, pursue the mission. But yeah, man, there absolutely was. There were times, look, I tell people all the time, I didn't hate every day at West Point, but I hated most of them, bro. Like I would call home and, wanting to leave there. And, again, I had strong parents, and I would try to get my mom on the phone. My dad would grab the phone. He'd say, "You're not leaving. Stop calling here." And he'd hang up the phone. And again, it's not necessarily the right answer, but it was the answer for me. And it kind of shook me out of that. And so again, you got to have good people around you. You got to have tough people around you. And it's okay to have those moments. They're human moments. The question is, when you have those moments, it can't be compromising the mission. It can't be compromising the job. You've got to be able to shake yourself out of that, have your human moment, and then say, okay, I'm done with that. What's the next task? And I think despite my resentment and despite my insecurities and despite my sort of feeling sorry for myself moments, I was always able to transition to the mission, ultimately.
Very brilliant perspective. Chris, we've talked a little bit about some of what makes you a great leader, some of these different qualities. I would say you're a very flexible individual. And the reason I say that is even if we harken back to my intro, which took my breath away, you have a vast array of expertise. Okay. So tell me, Chris, how does one become so flexible? How do you transition from a player to a captain in the Army, to a coach, to a media personality? Not a lot of people have worn as many hats as you.
I think, yeah, it's another great question, Subi. I think first of all, you got to be well read, man. Like, I tell people in the media all the time, and this applies to any job. You need to be able to speak, think, and write. I don't care if you're an economics major. I don't care if you're a communications major. I don't care if you're a physics major. Whatever job it is you want to do, you got to be able to speak, think, and write. And it's one of the reasons that in those various professions I have been able to be good, is because I always believed it didn't matter what the job was. I was going to be good in the room and I was going to figure it out. And so when I left coaching, I didn't know necessarily that I wanted to get into broadcasting. Ultimately, that's where it led. I knew I would figure it out, and look, part of that's a little bit of ego and arrogance, which I think we all have to have. You want to be good, you got to have a little bit of an ego about yourself. But the other part is a level of humility. So when you walk in the room, don't walk in the room like you own the room. Walk in the room like you want to fit into the room, and then allow your talents to do their work. Not every room I walked in, particularly in the military early on, was I an expert or was I the best there or the most capable? But I was going to figure out who was. I was going to attach myself to those people. And then we were going to figure it out together. And so that's where, and then you get into the coaching profession. When I got to Duke, and there's Steve Wojciechowski and Chris Collins and obviously Coach K and Chris Carrawell. Those guys had played there. They had been coaching for a long time. Like, look, there are things I can bring. There's a perspective that I had that they certainly didn't have. And there had been life experiences that I had owned that they hadn't owned. So I was able to walk into those rooms confidently, but also humbly. And it's the same thing in broadcasting. Like, I started out, everybody thinks, not everybody, but I think a lot of people assume I just arrived at ESPN doing games. No, man, I grinded out at CBS Sports Network doing Patriot League games for 3 years. Made a lot of mistakes. Loved the experience. And so now I feel prepared. I mean, that's the thing where, a lot of young people have to understand you don't arrive at the end without putting in the work. And by the way, if you put in the work, you are a lot more prepared to sustain and ultimately grow. And I have believed in process. It's not just something I'd say in speeches or to you on your podcast. I believe in process because I am a manifestation of process. I am a manifestation of what it means to put in the work, to prepare, and then ultimately when you get there, when it's time to perform, to say, let's do this. I am ready to crush this.
Right. It's not necessarily just running through that last piece of ticker tape at the end of the marathon. It's being able to sustain that and maybe run another marathon after that, right? Continue that journey. So I like the way you laid that out. Remind me though, again, quick, Chris, you said speak, think, and write. Is that what it was?
Yeah. You got to be able to speak, think, and write.
Okay. So that's I'm going to put that on the same level as like a Valvano speech. When Valvano goes, you got to laugh, think, and cry. All right.
Right.
That's where the thinking intersects.
Don't put it on that level, but yeah, it's a similar vein.
So yeah, those three that Valvano put, that's great advice for life. yours will apply to jobs. All right. So that's when you said that, I was just thinking of you in front of a mic, and we'll get you in front of that mic at one point. But so, I mean, this is all great insight into what makes you so flexible. And you mentioned your time at Duke, and I want to zero in on that a little bit now, because we haven't had many guests come on representing a blue blood program who's been on the bench of a national title winner. Um, you really only played one close game, and maybe you can keep me honest there. It's a little different when you're on the bench, but as a viewer looking at the games, you only played really one close game in 2010 tournament, and it was the title game. Can you tell me what made that Butler team such a challenge?
Yeah, it's a great question because I'll tell you what, man, we tried to, I mean, it was from Saturday after we beat West Virginia, and the game prior to us was Butler beating Michigan State. So we knew our opponent. From immediately in the locker room after beating West Virginia, Coach K began this mantra of, you have to understand how tough this Butler team is. You cannot look at them on film. You cannot look at them in layup lines and think that you are going to punk this team. This team is tough. They have pros on them. They are as well coached and as good defensively as any team we have played all season. And it wasn't just speak or coach speak. It was the reality. And look, I think I just covered the bulk of it. I mean, Brad was, and obviously Brad Stevens was a juggernaut, but people didn't know necessarily at that point yet that he was going to be incredibly good coach, had that team incredibly well schooled. They were as tough defensively as any team we played that year. As they were the best defensive team we played that year. And then look, they had Gordon Hayward, who was an NBA, I think he was an NBA All-Star, but certainly a longtime pro. They had Sheldon Mack, who was really good, Matt Howard, Ronald Norwood, who was as good a college point guard as there was in the game for 2 years. I mean, they had players also. So I can say this honestly, we definitely did not underestimate that team. I think we got the point across, and our guys were old enough to understand when we were trying to make a point. And so, the closeness of that game had every bit to do with the quality of Butler.
They were a tremendous team, and I'm a Celtics fan, so I kind of feel bad where we pilfered Brad Stevens, but I feel like that was always going to be the next move. But Butler's sustaining some good success. Hopefully we can see them return back to that level in the Big East under Thad Matta. But it was one of the best college basketball games I've seen in the history of watching it, obviously the title game. And it's funny, last off season, we had USC assistant coach Chris Capko on, and we actually talked about a half court heave. I think it was either in the Pac-12 tournament or maybe the NCAA tournament. And I wanted to get his view, his perspective, his description on that half court heave. I hope you know where this is going, Mr. Spatola.
Let's go.
The Gordon Hayward shot.
Mm-hmm.
Take me through your mind, your eyes, everything.
Yeah, I still remember it as vividly as any image during my time there. First of all, I remember vividly because you remember our benches they're lowered at the Final Four. So Coach K is up on his little stool there, and Chris Collins is up there talking to him as Brian Zubek goes to the foul line. And we're up 2, and Chris turns around and he's like got this look of shock on his face. And he screams to me and Wojo, he told him to miss it. He told him to miss it. And of course, Woj and I are just stunned because everything's moving so like kind of quickly, except for the shot. So the free throw goes up. Zubek, like a good soldier, probably not the greatest strategic move, but coach is a Hall of Famer, so I don't want to question it. Zubek, like a good soldier, misses the free throw, and Hayward comes down with it. And I'm telling you what, Subi, first of all, the clock could not move any slower. I could not believe, and Zubek did a nice job because he steps up. He actually forces Hayward to have to kind of go around him a little bit. Kyle Singler gets leveled with a screen, and the clock was moving so slowly. I'm like, oh my God, how much time is left on this clock? And that shot floated through the air as slow as anything. And I remember, and we were on the far end, and Wojo's standing right next to me, and we're kind of looking out. And that ball was in the air, I'm telling you, for 5 minutes, if it wasn't in the air for 3 seconds. And that thing caroms off. And it took a split second to be like, oh my God, we're national champions. I had never, and this is the God's honest truth, I had never allowed it to sink in, the idea of being a national champion, even as the director of operations. I mean, I felt, and that's the great thing about Coach K and his program, I felt it was as much mine as it was Shire's and Singler's and Wojo's and Coach K's. Like, I had put so much into my job, that the whole adage of do your job. I did my job. So I believed it was as much mine as anybody's. And I had never allowed the thought of being a national champion creep into my mind until that thing caromed off. And I immediately saw Coach, and I sprinted up onto the floor, and he and I had an unbelievable embrace. But I remember it as vivid as any image in the game of basketball as I've ever had.
Some tremendous detail there. I'm just thinking to myself, if I'm on the bench and Chris Collins looks back at me, he said he told him to miss it. It's like, what the hell you want us to do? That's
what's funny?
Decision.
You know what's funny? Amen to that. And I'm thinking in my head, well, he's got to know something I don't. Not Collins, Coach K. Like, I'm thinking, all right, that's what the commander wants. 10-4, let's execute. And I'm thinking, it wasn't until after the game that it became sort of a conversation that I was like, yeah, I think my initial instinct there was right. Like, really? This is what we're doing? I love Coach's strong defense of it, in the aftermath. Good for him. I think he would probably do it differently if he had it over again, but nonetheless.
Well, so that just goes back to your point, right? When you're talking to a soldier, Coach K's got his, 95% of the time you're in lockstep, but there's that other 5% where I'm sure Coach K is like, have you thought about this?
Right. Oh, and he's got the ultimate trump card. We won the game. All right, Coach, you're right. We did.
Yeah, he's got a piece of hardware to back that up, huh?
He's got 5 titles. Yep, he's got 5 of them.
So what I want to do now, Chris, pivot to a little bit of today's landscape this season, because it's been a wild year. It's been a blast, and I cannot wait for conference tournaments, NCAA tournament. So I just want to hit you with some quick hitters on what's been transpiring here recently. How about Buzz Williams and Texas A&M? I wasn't so sold on their out-of-conference schedule this year, but they're rolling a little bit here recently. And I think they're only a half game out behind Bama. They just beat Tennessee. Great win. Thoughts on Buzz, and those guys are going to go dancing unless we see an epic collapse.
No, they're going to go dancing, and thankfully, after Buzz went on his obnoxious rant at the end, after being left out last year, a year in which they did not deserve to be in, but they absolutely do deserve to be in this year. And look, he's won everywhere he's been, Buzz Williams. I mean, he's won obviously at Marquette, Virginia Tech, and now at A&M. He's a terrific coach. His teams share a similar DNA. They're hard playing teams, very good defensively. You're not going to push them around. And he's got really good guard play this year. I mean, Wade Taylor, we knew it coming into the year. I think he had a little bit of a lull, sort of end of non-conference play into the start of SEC play, but he's really come on and he's playing really, really well. So, yeah, I mean, Buzz does a great job, and it's just been an interesting league this year, the SEC, and I think A&M is unique in the respect that, again, I think they are really physical. They get after you defensively, and they have a really talented player in Taylor who's having a really good finish to the season.
Last offseason, I just had a lot of streams of consciousness, I guess, and I just threw out this blog. I was like, you know what? There's a lot of good teams in the state of Texas, and I included Texas A&M. I included Texas Tech, who's coming along a little bit, but I thought they were going to have Fardaz Amek the whole season. Then you got Texas, then you got Houston, then you got Baylor. I don't think it's terribly far-fetched to see maybe 3 or 4 teams from Texas in the Elite Eight.
No, there's not. I think coaching has a lot to do with it. I think those schools have hired well. Obviously Kelvin is one of the best. And look, I think Mark Adams is a good coach, but Chris Beard's DNA is certainly still at Texas Tech, and it's definitely still at Texas. So I think coaching is a part of that. And I think there's a lot of money, man, at those schools. And I think the NIL has made an impact. It certainly made an impact getting a Mac and getting some of the Pop Isaacs, getting some of those guys they have on their roster this year. Texas has a brand new facility, the Moody Center. It's beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. The Fertitta Center is relatively new. So yeah, it's interesting, and there's a wealth of talent in that state, and it's not like all those schools are strictly recruiting the state, but it's there's a wealth of talent in that state, and yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up though.
Final Four in Houston too, I believe.
Yeah,
So
yeah, you're right.
that'll be a lot of fun. You're our ACC guy. I'm gonna label you as our ACC guy because you spent time there at Duke. I feel like I've been defending the ACC because everyone's saying it stinks. I don't necessarily think that it stinks. I think it's more competitive than I think folks are giving it credit for. What say you about how would you diagnose the ACC?
I don't think the league stinks. I think it has what I'm calling an analytics problem. So much now of these referendums we drive on teams or leagues, Subi, is based on what the analytics are telling us. And it's one of my problems with people in our business. They don't have to watch, or they don't think they have to watch games anymore. They just tell you, well, they're first in offensive efficiency. Okay, well, why are they first in offensive efficiency? But that's a whole nother discussion for another day. I think the thing with the ACC is I do think the league is better this year than it was last year. I think there is a greater number of teams that can win in the NCAA tournament. The problem for the league in terms of its perception is the bottom of the league is terrible. Louisville's not good. Georgia Tech's not good. Notre Dame's had a bad season. You go down the line. What ends up happening is because those teams are bad, their analytics are bad, and you end up having to play those teams, it's going to have an impact not only on your analytics, but the analytics of the league. And it's why the league right now is 7th in terms of conferences nationally. It's behind the Mountain West, the ACC. And part of it is the league for 2 years straight has had a bad non-conference. Like, for example, the Big 12, I heard Billis throw out this number the other day. The Big 12 won like 83% of its non-conference games, some of those against other Power 5 leagues and teams. That's a great non-league performance, so that when you get into your league, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You end up helping yourselves just by playing those games. The Atlantic Coast Conference for 2 years running has had a brutal non-conference. So then they get into the league, and you could play a Louisville at home, win that game, and go down in the net. That's a problem. And so I think a lot of what's driving the analysis of the ACC is the analytics. And unless you watch NC State, unless you watch Pittsburgh, you don't know, right, Subi? I mean, you don't know that what those teams are capable of doing.
I'm glad you said that because I was looking at, and I think it is driven by the numbers like you had mentioned, but I look at a team like Pitt. We should be celebrating Pitt. They haven't been to the tournament in, I don't know, like a few years. We should be celebrating even a Clemson who's, they're killing me right now. I wanted to see them in the tournament, but wonderful start. They have 20 wins. We should be celebrating them. Miami. I'm a sucker for this Canes team, and I want to take them to the Final Four. And it's interesting you brought it up, Chris. If this conference is better than it was last year, and I think it was getting the similar flack, you look up and you say, well, wait a minute. Miami was in the Elite Eight, and half the field of the Final Four was ACC.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
yeah.
It can't be that terrible. I don't think. That's what I'm having a tough time reconciling.
Yeah, I think, look, there is a giant difference, and this is where I think the coaches in the league, they need to stop using performance in the NCAA tournament. They're mutually exclusive. Performance in the tournament and number of teams in the tournament or analysis by the committee, they are different. And I think the league has an analytics problem. But as far as teams getting better for example, West Virginia is on the bubble right now. West Virginia in the non-conference was only okay, and they are clinging for dear life to their Pittsburgh win, which happened in the second game of the season. Now, Pittsburgh has 4 transfers in their starting lineup. It was always going to take Pittsburgh some time to develop and get better. If Pittsburgh and West Virginia played today, I would pick Pittsburgh. But because, so that's where the timing, unfortunately, and if you don't like the process, then we got to change the process. But unfortunately for the league, the ACC, the committee uses the full body of work. So if you become better, and the reason, and by playing conference games in this time of the year, we have no idea if these teams in the ACC have gotten markedly better than they were during the non-conference. And so a lot of it has to do with the numbers. And I think, again, that's where the ACC's got to figure that out in the months of November and December.
What a world we're living in. I'm over here defending the ACC from being and saying it's underrated. I never thought growing up, right, I would have to do that. Yet here we are.
Yeah.
Chris, a few other questions I had for you here. Of course, there's some horrifying developments and details emerging out of Tuscaloosa. And obviously we want to keep the victim first in mind, but I host a college basketball podcast. I'm not a legalese expert. So I want to ask you, as someone who's been on a bench and who's played for a team, when these developments come out and these details maybe cast a cloud over the entire season. And I don't want to sound like I'm being crass, but they're having a wonderful season. How does that impact a team?
Well, I think to be determined. It's hard to know because I'm not necessarily in that locker room. I will tell you from my experience, I think organizations look to leadership in times of crisis. And if you want to be seen as trustworthy, everybody wants to have trust in their organizations. Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to be trustworthy as a leader. And I think the most disturbing thing about this Alabama situation is the way in which the leadership at Alabama has handled it. Look, I think ultimately this case will pivot and ultimately the future of Nate Oates, perhaps the AD, Greg Bird, I think pivots on the reality of whether or not they knew that Brandon Miller transported that gun to that scene. And if they did know and continued to play that young man, we got a serious problem. I think we already have a serious problem. But to answer your question about the locker room, it depends on what the players knew. And if the players knew that Brandon Miller brought that thing to the scene, or that the leadership handled this thing the way they did. And by the way, this is not going away. I mean, players are going to get questions. Coaches are going to continue to get questions. If they know that the leadership did not handle this thing well, then the foundation has the potential to crumble. And, again, I think there's a part of young people that can sort of be tunnel vision and just let's lock in on the task at hand. But their coach is going to be under siege here, Subi, for the next through the tournament. And I think ultimately how those players respond to that and ultimately how that locker room, ultimately evolves from this point forward. I don't know if any of us can know the answer to that.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, Chris. And of course, we're going to have to just wait and see what happens. Hey, let's pivot. Let's get you on out of here. I know we're running up against time, but I want to give you some quick hitters, have a little fun here. So let me preface this next question by saying I spoke to my father-in-law, future father-in-law, by saying, hey, I'd love to marry your daughter. I know everyone asks you what Coach K is like as a father-in-law. Can you tell us, first of all, let me start with this. Did you ask Coach K's permission to marry his daughter?
I did. I flew down. It was during my basketball season. And, during Christmas break, you get like 3 days, 2 days, something like that. But I used my Christmas break to fly down and ask him if I could marry her. He was a little bit tepid in his response. He's always been in my corner, but he was a little bit tepid, which was ironic, I found, because he and Mickey, his wife, got married on graduation day at West Point, which wasn't even the design Jamie and my wife and I had. But we were certainly going to wait. But I did. I asked him, and the rest is history.
Tepid, I got that response as well because my father-in-law, he's a very straightforward, no bones about it, man. He's folding his clothes. He's putting up a shirt on a hanger. And I quote, well, you got to live with her. So I was like, yeah. I just need a direct yes or no. That's not a no, is it?
No, that's a good question. Yeah, I didn't exactly know the answer either. And my wife was, My wife and I've known my wife since she was 14 years old. I've known my wife the majority of my life, and so there's really been no sort of secret. So she knew I was going to ask her dad. There was no secret that I was going to propose to her. And she was kind of on the stairs in the house when I was having this conversation with her dad. And I kind of, after I asked him, I kind of went to her upstairs. I was like, I don't know if he said yes. Like, do you have any sort of interpretation of what that was that we just had down
Oh, you need like a Krzyzewski Rosetta Stone.
there?
Just
Right.
enter it in there and be like, was that a yes or a no? Hey, how about the best stadium or venue or event that you have covered? I'm talking about the best game. Like,
Yeah.
give us the details.
I'll give you two. And just in terms of games I've called, and I'll take Cameron Indoor out of it, just for because these other two were pretty good, man. I called two games last year. One was at Fog Allen. It was the first time I had been there, and they were it was the resumption of the rivalry, the border war with Missouri. And I have to tell you, I was blown away, by the facility. Fog Allen is everything everybody tells you it is. It is all of those things and more. And the environment that day was as loud a place as I had ever been. Now the game was terrible. They blew out Missouri. It was the loudest place I had been until later last season. I did Chris Beard's return to Texas Tech as the head coach of Texas, and it was what I describe as a violent crowd, and I mean that metaphorically. I compare it to the Maryland crowds when we used to go play at Maryland when they were in the ACC, and sometimes they were literally violent, but like I'm just metaphorically speaking, violent, like sweating and just obscenities pouring out. Beard, when he was coming out of the locker room, had to have about 7 cops around him. And I'm telling you, Subi, it was as loud as any place I've ever been. It was what college basketball just should be and is meant to be. It was phenomenal. And so those two specific events are the two best I have been in an arena for.
Certainly not the first time we've heard fog by any player or coach or anything like that. The Texas Tech game, I remember that. I think I keep me honest here. I think it was a big Monday game, but I even remember when the bus rolled up.
Yeah.
The Longhorns bus rolled up. These folks, the fine folks of Lubbock, were ready to greet Chris Beard.
Well, it was so funny because the game was on ESPN2 and I was calling it, which eventually I got to a point, like I don't look that far ahead on my schedule, but eventually I got to the point I was like, oh my God, I'm calling that game. Why in the world am I calling that game? Like, why is Billis not here or Dick Vitale? Like, why am I here? So, I mean, I felt very lucky to be there that night. It was obviously historic. And I mean, crazy to say that it was the only time that Chris Beard returned to Texas Tech as the Texas coach. So it was a hell of a night, man. It was one of those and Ric Flair was in the building. I got a photo with him. It was a night I'll always remember.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Hey, how about as a player, toughest environment that you've had to play in?
So Cameron would be at the top of that list. When they started chanting "warm up the tank" instead of "warm up the bus" at the end of the game, I was like, yeah. And by the way, we had to play a good team. We had to play that team in 2001 that won a national championship. So I had to match up against Jay Will but that place, it was the first time I had been a camper there. That's how I met my wife. My dad would drive my brother and I down to Coach K's camp every summer, and so I'd been in the building, but I had never played there. And it's just so loud, and they would be out there an hour and a half before the game, just giving you a hard time. And then my wife she was my girlfriend at the time, was sitting behind the Duke bench, supporting her father, but also I'm out there playing, and we were getting blown out. And that was by far, it was both really cool to be playing in there, but it was also humiliating at the same time.
That's an interesting dichotomy there.
It is, and it was.
Yeah. I'm an Arizona grad. I wish maybe we had known each other. I would have picked your brain to see if we could have gotten any sort of advantages in that 0-1 title game for Arizona. But hey, that Duke team was remarkable. Yeah, Jay Williams,
That's right.
Battier, What a squad that was. Who is the toughest player that you've had to scout against as a coach, or even lace him up against? Who's like the one guy?
Yeah. So the toughest player, I'll go back to Jay Will. Although I matched up, we played Ohio State when I was at Army, and I had to match up against a guy named Scooney Penn. I don't know if you remember Scooney.
He's a Massachusetts guy.
He sure is. Yeah, Salem, Mass.
That's
And
right.
Jay Will's the best player I've played against. Although we used to play some pickup games when Kyrie was coming back from his injury, and we were trying to get him in shape. And I was actually a one of the best versions of myself as a basketball player because I never got to go play pro. But when I was at Duke, I really got myself in a pretty good shape, and so I was playing really, really well. And Kyrie was incredibly talented. But the best player when I was at Duke, the best player in my time there or the toughest player that we had to scout against, which the two could probably be the same, was Tyler Hansbrough. There was no player in my time at Duke who consumed a scouting report more than Tyler Hansbrough. We spent more time scheming how to guard him on the block, to keep him off the glass, to get back in transition because Ty Lawson was their point guard, who was a problem also. But, Tyler would find position early. He'd get the ball. I mean, just nobody. And we played against a lot of great players in my time at Duke. There was nobody who took more time, or we took more time preparing for, than Tyler Hansbrough.
Those are some incredible names. Legitimately a psycho team, and they don't call them that for no reason. Chris, you've been so gracious with your time. Thank you so much. I'm going to get you out of here. We're going to bookend this interview like I promised we would. We call this Bring Them Up on Stage. Is there anyone that you can point me in the direction to where I can Instagram DM them like I did you, touch base, and really essentially bug them to get them on and share some amazing stories like you've done? Anyone that you have in mind?
Does it have to be a basketball guy?
No, does not.
So I'm going to give you a guy that I work with a lot. He does our Sirius XM radio show, a guy named Roddy Jones. I don't know if you've talked to Roddy or if you know who Roddy is. Roddy was he was a football player at Georgia Tech. And Roddy's been, I think he was a carpet salesman when he graduated from Georgia Tech. He is now a rising star in the college football broadcast profession. He works for ESPN. He is fantastic. And I relate, Dallin, Cuff, Roddy, and I are similar in that we didn't play at Power. Well, Roddy did, but he wasn't a pro. Dallin played at Columbia. I played at Army. But I think we share a kinship because we work very hard at what we do, and we want to be good not just at sort of the knowledge of what we do, Subi, but we want to be good at the presentation. The three of us understand that this is an entertainment enterprise, so we share that DNA. Roddy's incredibly smart. He's incredibly articulate, thoughtful, and he's bright. And these are the people that I gravitate to. And he's a really good teammate, which that's very important to me. I want to be surrounded by people who are good teammates. And so I would throw Roddy in that category. So you absolutely have to talk to Roddy Jones. He's one of the best.
Roddy Jones, you are next on the list, my friend. And Chris Spatola, thank you so much, like I said, for spending some time. Incredible detail on all of your stories. This was a real treat. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the college hoops season.
I absolutely will, Subi. This was a pleasure, all of mine. I appreciate you asking me, and I enjoyed sharing the time with you, brother.